then chaps, hopefully you can see me. It's quite sunny today, this evening, and it's 10 to 8, which is, I don't really like the summer for that reason. We'll carry on with our 80 years ago this week stuff. Today, at about 2:30 in the morning, if not just a little bit before, HMS Verity was meant to be the last destroyer to have left Boulogne, and thereby bring an end to the evacuation of Boulogne. It officially surrendered later in the day, around about, the next day, the 25th, but more or less the evacuation was over. Something like only about 4,300 men were taken out of Boulogne over a couple of days. We tend to overlook Boulogne in the greater story of the battle of this time as the Battle of France. I mean, we're now 14 days after the German invasion, or at least the German invasion of the Low Countries, and France followed in the day or two after that. And indeed, Calais is still taking place as I speak, so to speak, and is in a lot worse state than Boulogne is. Now, effectively, I believe it's on the 24th. I get muddled, and I'm going to do a rather cheeky glimpse of my Seabag Montefiore, but I do know my stuff, and I'm not trying to sound big-headed, but I absorb stuff from a book better than I do. Yes, the 24th. Brigadier Claude Nicholson, who is almost the unsung hero of Calais. I say hero, just he went about his job with a fairly proper attitude. The trouble is he died in captivity in 1943 because of course he was taken prisoner at Calais, and from what anyone see, he never recorded. Some people wrote books in POW camps, but Nicholson, it seems, never spoke to anyone or wrote down his thoughts about Calais. And had he survived the war, I'd imagine we would have had a fantastic source about his views and thoughts, because effectively on the 24th he was sending messages saying, look, if you don't come and get us, indeed he said 7:05, reinforcement urgent if whole garrison be not overwhelmed. And back home there's this stuff going on about the fact, in the cabinet and with the French, that that by now there's been a split almost between the British and the French leadership, politically and militarily. The French don't think the British are pulling their weight, more or less, or it looks like the British are trying to get out of France as quickly as they can and leave the French alone. The British don't think the French have done enough, or seeming to want to take the attack to the Germans. The French are making vague plans to counter-attack on or after a certain date, as opposed to sort of like, well, we're going to attack on the 25th and go for it. And you had minor exceptions like Charles de Gaulle and his 4th Armoured, but otherwise there was now this lack of cohesion. It wasn't there's enough books on the topic for you to check out, and in some respects it's still something that rattles on now. I think there's certain French people, I'm sure, that of a certain age who think Dunkirk overlooked the French, even though at some point during the evacuation Churchill said to Ramsay, look, you've got to make sure you're getting French troops off as well. So Nicholson, he's besieged in Calais now for a couple of days already, and there's some really desperate fighting going on in the suburbs. And the War Office decided to message him at 11:23 p.m. It says here, fire one of our destroyers, HMS Wolfhound, and I'll quote you the message. In spite of policy of evacuation given you this morning, fact that British forces in your area now under brackets for guard, the French commander, who has ordered no evacuation, means that you must comply for the sake of Allied solidarity. Your role is therefore to hold on. Harbour being for present of no importance to BEF, no reinforcements. You will select best position and fight on. In a way, he was betrayed, I suppose. He and all the men in Calais were hoping at least that there was going to be some help from home. And the Navy had been patrolling off Calais, waiting for the instruction to go in, and one ship was sunk. And it should be remembered that by and large, the Royal Navy's presence at Boulogne, Calais, and latterly Dunkirk were older destroyers for the most part, V&W class destroyers that were built towards the end of this First World War and just after it, of which there must have been at least a good 20 or so. and of course all had names starting with VW. And then you had the more modern destroyers that were coming into surface, and during the evacuation at least 8 of them got told to get back to Dover because Ramsay was trying to protect the more modern ships that were more of a match to the German surface fleet, what was left of it after Norway, than the V&Ws, which ended up being, the backbone of the Atlantic convoys and the Arctic convoys. And that's not to take anything away from the Flower class escort ships, but the V&Ws were, they got their money's worth in the Second World War. So the Navy couldn't go in as much as it probably wanted to, and Nicholson, he essentially decided to fight on. The Germans at some point during the siege of Calais came under a flag of truce and told him, look, it's probably best, old chap, you surrender, kind of thing. And Nicholson said, well, more or less, it is the British duty, it's the duty of the British Army to carry on fighting much as the Germans would do. And I applaud Nicholson. As I say, terribly little seems to be known about him. He's the kind of chap in a way that would have had films and books written about, done about him in the 50s, when there was a rash of, post-war memoirs and films, and, the Goon Show makes fun of every general having some kind of memoir coming out, and yet he's vanished into the mists of time, to the point that that's why I like the film Darkest Hour, because it not only shows you some of Calais, and there's a brief bit about Calais, but you also see Claude Nicholson, and again, it's a very brief moment. So that's all going on 80 years ago, and back home, there's already a fear about invasion. Now, hindsight's a wonderful thing, and as I said before, my lecturer told me, and others, that as a historian, you don't use hindsight. The idea of history is that you sort of, you peel away, say, Dunkirk, and you look at things. But the trouble is, it's hard not knowing, it's hard doing so without sort of going, well, obviously, there was ultra decrypting codes that, at least Dunkirk, but obviously after it, the Atlantic convoys and that was saved, and, prior to D-Day, there was this large deception of spies and the like. Yes, you can read about in Ben McIntyre's Double Cross, and there's all this little bits and pieces. So with with the threat of invasion, we can safely look back and go, well, Germans didn't really have the means to invade. They would need air superiority and, a relatively clear English channel of the Royal Navy. And the Royal Navy in those days had more than Portsmouth in the area, to get ships from, bases at Harwich and Chatham, for instance. So there was a fear that the Germans were going to come over, land in East Anglia maybe, or straight after Dunkirk, and at some point maybe from Ireland, try from Ireland, or land on the Isle of Wight and all this stuff. And it was taken quite seriously, they thought D-Day, around sort of D-Day, Hitler was going to try and land on the Isle of Wight and occupy it. And that's something I've said before about it. I find it a rather curious idea. Germany in 1944 didn't have the means to do anything offensively, by and large. I mean, the Battle of the Bulge was scraped together in comparison to, say, the invasions of France, Poland, etc. And no air superiority. I mean, by D-Day, the Allies ruled the air and did all the way to the end. The Luftwaffe were annihilated effectively by the time of the Bulge, and the Ardennes operation finished them off. So, but that's Britain in 1940. Dunkirk is about to happen. It starts on the 26th of May, Operation Dynamo anyway. Calais has got a couple more days left in it before that too falls under. And the German army is looking fairly invincible. And the Luftwaffe have not done too badly out of it either. So far, they managed to help pulverise Poland in 6 weeks, and then they did fairly well in Norway, although they won't, you don't really think of the Luftwaffe in Norway as mostly in the forwards and that. And then they helped drive the Blitzkrieg in the west. So they look fairly imperious. And from the word go, the RAF Fighter Command in particular was on the back foot. 6 months of phony war have suddenly come to an end. These chaps have been based in the gardens of mansions and wherever an airfield is situated, and they've gotten fairly complacent maybe, or they're being taught out what soon already is outdated ways of flying and fighting. And next, May 10th, they're kicked out of most of these airfields, or at least, under threat. The Luftwaffe pulverise a lot of formations. Usually Taylor and Charlie doesn't know anything about it. They fly in their outdated First World War formations in places, and despite the fact they have, and they're mostly Hurricanes, of course. Spitfires were still relatively minor. And they get kicked across France at some point, and I found the date once, I want to say it's the 28th of May, all Hurricane squadrons in France were told to come home. And France was still demanding that Churchill sent our fighter squadrons over, as late as now really, but Fighter Command said Dowding didn't want to send any more over. He had already one mind on the invasion that everyone was expecting coming, but also the Battle of Britain, which would need to be fought for the Germans to gain superiority over the skies of England. And Bomber Command, everyone that knows the answer World War II, sort of has images of Lancasters and Wellingtons and the like from about 42, 43, pulverising German towns and cities and centres of industry and military targets, but Bomber Command were in it from the start as well as the Royal Navy, and once they got that silly phase of dropping leaflets on the Germans, they tried taking the fight to the Germans, especially during the Battle of France, and they were a lot of the squadrons were annihilated, or at least the flights they were sending over, and the aircraft were hideously obsolete in some respects, but then the Germans had confidence, and the RAF leadership, as good as it tried, was disorganised in some respects. It seems from May 10th, as far as the Air Force and the Army goes, it was such a shock to the system that they were on the back foot from day one, all the way through to the end of Operation Dynamo and the surrender of France. That's what it looks like if you ever read any history of books, or indeed if you watch the John Mills Dunkirk film from 1958, and for the first half of the film, as Mills and his men start walking to Dunkirk, because their unit gets left behind. They don't know that everyone else has pulled out, for example. You get this map animation of, the German advance, and that film does a better job of underlining the desperate situation the British found themselves in than Christopher Nolan's film, personally. So, I guess that's your May 24th, 1940, and there's more where that came from.